So we're starting. So we're talking today about Theodor Herzl and what I call Herzl's Enigma. And after that, maybe we'll have a short Q&A with Eran as time provides. Um, so you all know me, so no need for lots of introductions. So I'm taking you back to 1895 to Paris. And Herzl has lots of friends in Paris at that time. And he's missing. He's gone missing for 2 weeks. Nobody sees him. Nobody hears anything from him. And one day, one of his friends, a guy called Emil Schiff, receives a letter from him asking him to drop by to Herzl's house. He wants to see him. So, of course, Herzl he's been missing for 2 weeks. So Emil goes to see what's there, and he knocks on Herzl's door, and Herzl open up the doors, and Emil is horrified because Herzl looks terrible. His hair is kind of disheveled, and his clothes are rumpled, and he looks ill. He looks as if something is very wrong with him. And Herzl says to him, "Come to my study. I want to read to you a book that I've written. It's the book called The State of the Jews." And they walk to the study, and then Herzl really reads his book to Emil. It takes a couple of hours, and when he's done, Emil starts crying. And Herzl thinks that Emil is crying because he's very emotional because of all the ideas that Herzl is discussing in his book about the need to create a state for the Jews in Palestine, the land of the Jews. And he thinks that Emil is emotional, but in reality, Emil is crying because he thought that Herzl has lost his mind. Because he knew Herzl, and he knew that Herzl has no connection to Judaism. And he never spoke about the Jewish problem or the Jewish people. And he doesn't know too much about Jews outside of where he was living back in Germany and Austria. And he thought that maybe Herzl is just gone through some sort of a mental breakdown, a nervous breakdown. And he tries to convince Herzl to not publish his manuscript because he says to him, everybody will ridicule you. And of course, Herzl does not agree. Herzl still decides to go ahead and publish the book. And how this all ends, we all know. Herzl started the international Zionist movement. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world flocked around him and followed his lead in establishing that huge international movement. And they started the organization, the formal organization that culminated, we have somebody entering, that culminated in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So essentially, Herzl was right. But here's the enigma. We shouldn't be surprised that Emil Schiff thought that Herzl has lost his mind. Because in 1895, Herzl was nobody. He was an author and somewhat of a bit well-known playwright, but not too much. And he was completely disconnected from the Jewish community around him. And he basically was a nobody in terms of international politics. Yet in 9 short years, from 1895 up until he passed away at 1904, Herzl managed to establish an international movement and got hundreds of thousands of followers from all over the world. So this transformation is almost unique. I mean, we don't know of a lot of cases of great figures in history who managed to make such a transformation within such a short time. And actually, Herzl managed to do something that no other Jewish leader has managed to do in 2,000 years of history. So how did that happen? It's a very interesting question. So to answer that, I'll take you way back to Herzl's youth. And he was born in what is now Budapest in Hungary to a couple of very highly educated parents. And he was raised as a Jew, but he had no real connection to Judaism. He went to a Jewish school as a young child, but he says that he doesn't remember anything that he learned there. and he only remembers the beatings that he received from his teachers. And when he grew up, he basically left Judaism almost altogether and concentrated on what he liked to do, which was writing. That was the great passion of his life. He became a lawyer, but then he quit being a lawyer and dedicated himself to being a journalist and a playwright. So he had no real connection to Judaism. And in 1889, he married Julie Nashauer, and they ultimately had 3 kids. But it was a very unhappy marriage. He wasn't very happy. She wasn't very happy. And it all came to sort of a low point in his life in 1891, where the difficult marriage, the relationship that he had, plus some of his plays didn't really succeed. They kind of tanked in the box offices in Germany. And a good friend of his committed suicide. So it was a very difficult year for Herzl, and it culminated in him leaving his family and moving to live in Paris. And while he was in Paris, he was working for the newspaper that he was used to work with back in Vienna, and he was covering current events in Paris. And one of the most important events to take place back then was what's known as the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a French officer, a military officer, and he was accused of treason. And the trial that he had was very public, and it got a lot of headlines. And what that ultimately led to was a huge wave of anti-Semitism that swept France at that time, including rallies in the street and burning Jewish signs and beating Jews in the streets, etc. So Herzl was covering all of that anti-Semitism, and it kind of reminded him of the anti-Semitism that he used to experience as a child in Budapest and later in Vienna. So it kind of raised the question of anti-Semitism again to his consciousness, and it kind of caused him to rethink how he should address that problem, because up until that point, implicitly, his idea of overcoming anti-Semitism was to assimilate in the general population. You saw his picture. He was basically a modern European gentleman of his time. He was highly educated. He was fluent in 3 languages, right? German, French, and English. He dressed like a European gentleman, and he had none of the outside markings of a Jew. And he figured that, especially in Western countries like France, was a liberal country, really forward thinking, and the population was very highly educated relative to the rest of Europe, that their anti-Semitism would be almost gone. But what he saw with his own eyes kind of made him realize that no, that's not going to happen. But interestingly enough, we're talking about 1894. That's 1 year before he published or he wrote The State of the Jews. And when he started thinking about how to solve the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem of the Jews, his first idea was very different than what we think of when we think about Herzl. His first idea was to have a sort of a mass event with taking place in lots of cathedrals simultaneously in Europe, where all the Jews in Europe will convert to Christianity. And that was his initial idea. And of course, this idea was kind of ridiculous, and all his friends told him so. So he forgot it quite quickly. But then he started thinking about other ideas. And roughly at that point, he wrote a play called The New Ghetto, which is somewhat of a semi-autobiographical play. In it, the main character, the protagonist, is a Jewish man who tries to assimilate in the general population, educated, dresses like, a modern Christian man, etc., etc. Kind of spitting image of Herzl himself, except that all his attempts fail and he ultimately is killed because of being a Jew. So one researcher thinks that the writing of The New Ghetto, there are actually several researchers, that the process of writing that play, The New Ghetto, was sort of maybe a therapeutic process for Herzl. That while writing that play, he thought of the ideas that later went on to be the ideals of the Zionist movement. So maybe that's what made that stark transformation himself that Emil and the rest of his friends were unaware of. That's why it seems so sudden and abrupt in terms of what he did. And then he published the book, The State of the Jews, in which he describes the future state of Israel, that what it became to be, and his very detailed vision, and he sees Israel as a kind of an advanced nation with very industrial and very liberal, kind of, he thinks about it as a sort of a mini Germany in a sense. And just as Emil Schiff told him, warned him, everybody around him kind of ridiculed him. I mean, his friends came to Herzl and asked him, "Are you serious with that book, or is that kind of a joke that we don't get?" I mean, most of the people either ridiculed him or actually opposed him, because some people were afraid that because he's sort of inciting national feelings inside of his readers, Jewish readers, people, people around them would think that they are not actually good citizens, loyal citizens to the countries in which they live in. So it could be a bit dangerous even. But Herzl wasn't very much afraid of that. But although in Western Europe, Herzl didn't have many followers, in Eastern Europe, that was a very different situation, because in Eastern Europe, there was very strong anti-Semitism, coupled with actual hostility and violence against the Jews, what we all know to be the pogroms. Hundreds, thousands of Jews died in violence, and every once in a while there were riots against the Jews, etc. So there, the situation was very, very different. And because of that, in the later half of the 19th century, there was a kind of a grassroots movement called the Lovers of Zion that grew in Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, etc. And these people were, they thought the same way that Herzl did, that we should colonize the land of Israel, Palestine, and have settlements there and work towards an independent Jewish country. So his ideas kind of found a very welcome, a very warm welcome in Eastern Europe, and he received lots of supportive letters from there. But interestingly, initially, Herzl didn't really think very much about the common Jews back then. He saw them as being poor, uneducated, basically common people, insignificant common people who were not sophisticated enough to help him reach his goal, to realize his dream of creating a state of the Jews. He was working for them, but he didn't want to work with them, essentially. He thought that the key people who would help him were the Jewish elite, the Jewish wealthy Jews, people like Edmond James de Rothschild and Maurice de Hirsch from French, people who were rich, very wealthy, plus they were connected with governments and royalty all over the world. So he thought that he might be able to convince them to help him realize his dream, but they both shut him down very, very fast, because they said to him, "Oh, we've got Yasmin Abdelkader Khalil entering." Okay. And he thought that they would help him, but in fact, they were very much afraid of him, because these two men already had plans of their own. They had colonies that they were funding in Palestine, in other places, and they were afraid that back then Palestine was under the Ottoman rule, and they were afraid that by trying to incite a sort of independence of the Jews in Palestine, the Ottoman Empire would frown upon these kinds of initiatives, because it would seem some sort of a rebellion, and they would actually harm their initiatives and projects in Palestine. So they didn't help him, and only then did Herzl decide that he wanted to really connect with the common Jewish population and rally the common people around him. And here we begin to answer the question which I raised in the beginning of my talk. How come Herzl managed to do something that no Jewish leader was able to do for 2,000 years. Well, Herzl had a few core competencies or strengths in him. The first was that he understood the power of mass media. He was a writer, an author. He worked in a newspaper. He was very much aware of the power of mass media, of newspapers, to influence public opinion. And for example, the first thing he did when he decided that he wanted to rally the common people around him was to establish a new paper called Die Welt, the World, in 1897, in which he was the editor and the main writer. And his writing was very eloquent and very compelling, and he could, he could express his ideas and dreams in a very compelling way. So that was one thing. The other is that he personally had tremendous passion for that project. And whenever he talked to people, it was obvious that he was very passionate about it. And that sort of passion kind of drew Jewish activists to him. People like Max Nordau and Isidor Shalit, who rallied to him really in the early days and helped him start, organize the movement. So that was also very important. And the last thing, which is kind of superficial maybe, but it is important. It is important. Everybody who spoke, who met Herzl in person, always commented how impressive he was in person. I mean, you can look at that picture and you can see it yourself. He was very tall. He dressed like an aristocrat. He had a great beard. He had deep brown eyes, which had a kind of a very intimidating effect, very captivating effect. And his hair was always calm as it should. He looked the part of the statesman, the sophisticated statement, and he also had the education and the fluency in languages to feel at home in royal courts, in government offices. So he knew his way around these kind of things. He looked the part, which is a bit superficial, but it is important. So Herzl's first step in actually practically realizing his dream was to start what is known as the first Zionist Congress in 1897. His idea was to gather delegates from all the Jewish communities around Europe and other places around the world and bring them to a single event and really start the Zionist movement going. And initially he thought of having that event be in Munich, in Germany. But the Jewish community in Munich asked him not to have that event there because, as I said, in Western Europe, there was a lot of resistance to Herzl's ideas. People were afraid of the implications of his ideas. So they didn't want anything to do with him. So he moved the Congress to Basel in Switzerland. And there, his people rented a hall in Basel. But when Herzl came to see that hall in person, just a few days before the Congress itself, he was horrified to see that this was some sort of a theater, complete with trampolines and all that stuff. And Herzl, as you might have already guessed, was a man who very much valued appearances. He thought that everything should look the part. Everything that impression is very important. So he couldn't have that Congress be in place that would have the kind of connotation of clowns and stuff. So he immediately canceled that contract and rented another hall, which was actually a casino, but it looks very much impressive, as you can see in that picture. And he invited also hundreds of journalists to cover the event. As you see the journalists up on the second floor, the delegates are on the first floor. And everybody who was at the first Zionist Congress described it as being electrifying. The atmosphere was amazing, and everybody was so emotional because they had the feeling that they were actually participating in an historic moment. You can see the actual flag that would later go on to become the flag of Israel, which was first created for that Zionist Congress. So it was a very emotional event. When Herzl took the stage to speak, there were applause for 15 minutes straight. And that Congress had two impacts. The first was that Herzl really established in that Congress the formal organization of the Zionist movement. It is a very important step because you have to have organizations, really working organization, in order to realize a practical dream. So something like the Jewish National Fund was created at that event to start organizing the efforts of Jews from all over the world. So if, in a practical sense, that Congress was very, very important. And also, it was kind of a watershed moment for the Zionist movement, because up till then, up till the first Zionist Congress, everybody thought of Herzl as kind of being a weirdo, a dreamer who doesn't really know anything. Remember, he was basically a journalist, and he wasn't familiar with anything related to Judaism. But after that event, when people actually saw how serious he was and how this event was organized in the way it was organized, people really changed their opinion, and support for the Zionist movement really grew exponentially after that. So now came the point where Herzl had to really do what he was planning to do. I mean, start actually practically moving forward. So as I mentioned earlier, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And so the first thing that Herzl tried to do, he used his connections and networking in Europe to get a meeting with the Ottoman Sultan. And the Sultan almost immediately shut him down, said, no, you're not going to get any sort of an autonomy in Palestine for the Jews, because Palestine is a land for all religions and not only for the Jews. So no, you won't get it. So that avenue of progress was shut down immediately. But Herzl had another card up his sleeve, you might say. Germany was a very important ally for the Ottoman Empire. They had strong economical connections. They had mutual things that they cared about in the Middle East. So it took Herzl about a year and a half, but he finally got a personal meeting one-on-one with the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And he, again, using connections with people who supported him in the German government. And when he met Wilhelm II, he told him about his ideas of creating a state for the Jews and having all the Jews in Europe come to that state, etc., etc. And a bit maybe surprisingly, Wilhelm was very supportive of Herzl's ideas. He said, "Man, you know, these are good ideas." And you might be wondering why was Wilhelm so supportive? I mean, did he grow some sort of a Jewish feeling inside of him? So no, actually, Wilhelm was just as anti-Semite as a lot of his environment was back in the day. And he liked Herzl's idea mainly because it meant that Herzl will take all the Jews from Germany and move them to his new state. So that would solve a lot of problems, because Wilhelm actually saw the Jews in Germany as being more trouble than they were worth, basically. So they scheduled another meeting. Wilhelm was supposed to visit in the Holy Land in Palestine in 1898, a few months later. So they they scheduled a meeting in Jerusalem during Wilhelm's visit. So a few months go by, and Herzl and a few of his colleagues travel by boat to Egypt, and from there to the port of Jaffa. Here you see Herzl on the ship on the way to Jaffa. And once they're there, they do sort of a tour of the Holy Land. They visit the colonies and several villages, etc. And of course, the Ottoman authorities are somewhat uneasy about all this, because they're afraid that Herzl, being sort of a leader for the Jews, will incite a rebellion in Palestine against the Ottoman authorities. So while Herzl is traveling Palestine, there's always an Ottoman secret agent following him around with a signed arrest warrant in his pocket, so that if Herzl says something wrong, he'd be immediately thrown to jail. But that didn't happen. Herzl behaved himself, you might say. And then actually there were two meetings between Herzl and the Kaiser in Palestine. The first one was a kind of an accidental meeting, you might say. They met for a few minutes in an agricultural school called Mikveh Israel that Herzl visited. And they just shook hands and talked about the weather and said, okay, we'll meet again in a few more days in Jerusalem. And there's a very famous photograph from that meeting that you'll see everywhere, probably, that you'll search that meeting in Wikipedia or whatever, except that this particular picture is fake. You might say that it was photoshopped, if there was a Photoshop back then. These are the original images. The guy who took the picture was one of Herzl's friends, colleagues, was too excited, too nervous because of the magnanimity of that event. So when he took the picture, he actually missed Herzl completely, and all you could see of Herzl was his left foot, which I kind of marked in an arrow. And so later, when they returned to Jaffa, he took another picture of Herzl, and he combined the two pictures into one which was faked, but history is for the people who write it probably, so that kind of remained. So a few days later, Herzl goes to Jerusalem, and they meet with the Kaiser. And as you can see, Herzl always was very, very, he was very, very appreciative of appearances. So he insisted, although his friends kind of didn't like the ideas, he insisted that they all wear suits for the meeting. You can see the attire. They are very formal, black suits, cylinder hats, gloves. It's kind of comedic to think about them, you know, under the harsh Mediterranean sun, and standing in what is obviously like a barren field, looking as if they just stepped out of a Viennese cafe somewhere. But that was Herzl for you. And they meet the Kaiser, and that meeting goes well. Herzl asks the Kaiser formally for Germany to support or take responsibility for the Jewish colonies in Palestine. And the Kaiser is kind of non-committal at that point. He says, it could be a good idea, I'll think about it, something like to that effect. So they return to Europe, and then they get bad news. It appears that the Kaiser had no intention of actually accepting Herzl's request. And when the German government published a formal summary of the meeting between them, there's no mention of Herzl's request for Germany to take some sort of authorship on the Jewish communities. So the Kaiser says to him, basically, that's the Kaiser's way of signaling to Herzl that won't happen. So that was a pretty devastating blow for Herzl, who worked really hard to get Germany's assistance in that. But there's another avenue. So Herzl puts his faith in the British Empire, back then greatest empire on earth. And he's meeting Joseph Chamberlain, who is the Secretary of State of the colonies. And it turns out Chamberlain is very supportive of Herzl and his goals, partly because he supported Herzl on a personal level, and partly because there were lots of Eastern European Jews who immigrated to England at that point in time. And the English didn't really love that idea. So they were hoping that if Herzl manages to create some autonomy for the Jews, all these Jews would move to that autonomy and they would leave England. Nobody liked the idea of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, sorry. So Chamberlain offers Herzl a piece of territory in El Arish, in the north of the Sinai Peninsula, because, of course, Palestine itself is under Ottoman rules, so Britain can help there. But Sinai is pretty close geographically to Palestine. It also has that sort of historical connection to the Jewish people, right? It also has that connection to the Jewish people. And Herzl accepts, he thinks that a good idea, that might be a good stepping stone for further work to actually create a state in Palestine itself once the Ottoman are gone from the picture. But after a few months of deliberations, the scheme basically fails because the British authorities in Egypt, in Cairo, resist the idea. They don't like the idea of a Jewish settlement back there in Sinai. They have to transport lots of water from the Nile to El Arish. It's not practical for them, so they don't like it, and the idea kind of falls through. But then Chamberlain has a brilliant idea. He offers Herzl territory in an area in Kenya known as Hussein Gishu. It's pretty close to Uganda, plus there is a railroad between Uganda and that area called Ugandan Railroad. And that's why that offer gets the name the Uganda Scheme, the Uganda Scheme. And here we get to see something very interesting, because initially Herzl was very focused on Palestine, not because he thought that it is a great idea, because he knew that most of his followers want to go back to the historical land of Israel. So he basically thought only about Palestine. But then Chamberlain offers Uganda or Kenya, whatever, and Herzl agrees, which is very strange when you think about that offer and that he agrees to it. And at that point, there's a kind of I mean, half of the historians think that Herzl really meant what he said to Chamberlain. The others don't think that they didn't really mean that. What do I mean by that? Some historians think that Herzl was really worried about the state of Jews in Eastern Europe. He was worried because of the pogroms, and especially there was the Kishinev pogrom at that particular, exactly when he was meeting with Chamberlain. News came of the pogrom in Kishinev, in which thousands of Jews were murdered. So he thought, Herzl believed that actually the Jews were being exterminated in Eastern Europe, and you have to get them to safety. It could be temporarily in Uganda if need comes to be, but that was his way of thinking. Other historians think, and Herzl even alluded to that himself in later years, that he never really believed in Uganda being a practical solution, because he knew nobody would accept that solution. But he was very much interested in gaining Britain's support for the Zionist movement, because actually back then, Britain was the only country, or the only or official country, which actually recognized the Zionist movement as a sort of a national movement. Recall that back then, Judaism was purely religion. It wasn't a national movement. So enlisting the help of the British government was very important to him. Maybe they could influence the Ottomans or the Germans. And rejecting Chamberlain's offer right off the bat would be sort of disrespectful. So he accepted it with no real he didn't really mean to go through with that idea. So we'll never know that the answer for sure, for certain. What is certain, that when he took it to the stage in the 6th Zionist Congress and described the Uganda scheme to the delegates, it created a huge rift inside the Zionist movement. After he spoke, half the delegates got up and walked out of the hall, and they didn't want to meet with him. People were crying because they felt that Herzl was betraying them, and actually that rift only grew and grew. And at some point, someone even tried to assassinate Max Noda, one of Herzl's closest followers, and the organization of Jews in Russia declared that if Herzl doesn't back down from the Uganda scheme, they are actually going to establish a rival Zionist organization, and in essence splitting the Zionist group, which probably would kind of make the dream of the Zionist dream irrelevant anymore. So that was a huge rift in the Zionist movement, and ultimately Herzl had to step down from the idea, and he declared that no, that Palestine is going to be the land of the Jews, and give up the idea of Uganda, although maybe he never actually intended to anyway. Plus, the British themselves kind of cooled down on that idea as well. The British settlers in Africa weren't also very much in favor of having, an autonomy of Jews being created just in their backyard. So everybody kind of left that scheme to be. And in 1904, when he was only 44 years old, pretty young, Herzl passed away due to some respiratory illness, and it was a very sad event for Jews from all over the world. I mean, he was revered as a leader. People were devastated when he passed away. There, in his funeral in Vienna, thousands of Jews from all over Europe came to attend the funeral, and he was buried in Vienna. And Later in 1949, his remains were actually brought to Israel and interned in what's known as Mount Herz'l in Jerusalem in 1949. And of course, he is considered one of the most important, if not the most important, figure that contributed to the establishment of the State of Israel. And one final interesting anecdote in that term is that in Herzl's diary on the 3rd of September 1897, it was, just a few days after the first Zionist Congress, he writes these words: "Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it." And that's a very amazing, that's a rather amazing paragraph to write, because really, I mean, it was a ridiculous dream at that point. But Israel was established in 1948. That's 51 years after these words were written, which means that Herzl only missed his prediction with 1 year, which is kind of amazing. So we started the talk with an interesting question. How come Herzl, who was just a journalist, a playwright, not very much connected to his Jewish roots, to the Jewish community, very much an unknown person at that time, within only 9 short years, managed to create an international Zionist movement and was followed by hundreds of thousands of people and ultimately led to the creation of State of Israel. So how did that came to be? And I think that we already saw some of his characteristics that probably contributed to his success. We talked about his passion, his use of mass media, his personality and good looks, that was very important for his success. But I think that there's one more important thing to consider, is that Herzl was very much a man of very deep contradictions. One of the most contradictory, contradictive person that I've ever came across when researching about him. On the one hand, he was a dreamer. He was able to rise above the current state of affair in Europe for the Jews and dream about a state that would look in a certain way, that would behave in a certain way, things that everybody around him thought were fantasies, wild fantasies. And he really wrote these ideas in his books, and he wrote them very elegantly. So people really flocked around him due to the fantastic dreams that he was describing. On the other hand, he was also very much a doer. He was what would call probably a bulldozer right nowadays. He could, when he wanted to create an international event, recall this is the late 19th century. There's no internet, right? It's kind of hard to get so many people in Basel in Switzerland, and he does that, and he organizes the event fantastically good, and he organizes the organization itself, the establishing the Jewish National Fund, etc. And when he wants to meet leaders and important peoples in Europe, he meets them. He goes and he does whatever he needs to do to put his foot in the door and do what needs to be done. So he's also he's dreamer and someone who can move things around when needed. So that's a kind of a contradiction, which was very important, because you have to be kind of both if you want to realize what is nearly impossible. The other contradiction inside him was that, I mean, his connection to Judaism, as we said, was pretty slim. Yet he used whatever connection he had in every opportunity that he had. He always consulted rabbis when he had important decisions, and when he gave talks, he always used metaphors and stories from the Bible, from the Torah, and always inserted words in Hebrew and in Yiddish in his talks. So he gave the Jews around him the sense that he was one of them, that he is a Jew and he knows Judaism and he feels their pains and needs. All that, while, as we've seen, being a very, very much a man of his time, both dressing the part, being very much educated, fluent in all the important languages, feeling at home in royal courts, etc. So again, that's some sort of a very deep contradiction that is probably very helpful if you're trying to rally the masses behind you and get the powers in Europe to help you, to assist you in what you're trying to create. So I think these contradictions probably were very important for Herzl to help him realize his dream, which is why I think, which is why I call this talk Dr. Theodor and Mr. Binyamin Zeev, the kind of Mr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.